The first time my family begged me for mercy, they did it on their knees in a hospital parking lot. Rain had been falling since dawn, leaving the pavement black and shining beneath the white hospital lights. My father's expensive wool coat was spread across the asphalt. My mother's carefully styled silver hair clung to her wet cheeks. My younger sister, Selena, held both hands around my wrist, as though I might disappear again if she loosened her grip. "Please, Vivian," she sobbed. "Emily is dying." Behind them, through 6 floors of illuminated windows, my 5-year-old niece lay in the pediatric oncology unit, preparing for a stem cell transplant. The doctors had tested every available relative. They had searched the National Registry. They had repeated the tissue matching because Selena refused to believe the first result. "I was the strongest available match. You're her best chance," Selena whispered. "I know what we did was unforgivable, but Emily didn't do any of it." My mother covered her face. "She is innocent." The words were almost unbearable coming from her. 18 months earlier, my 7-year-old son, Caleb, had been struck by a delivery truck on his way to school. While he lay dying, my father presented himself to the hospital as Caleb's legal medical guardian. After the funeral, my family used the insurance benefit connected to my son's death to finance Selena's wedding. At the ceremony, Selena wore the handmade necklace Caleb had given me the night before he died. Then they told me to move on. So, I disappeared. They believed grief had broken me. They never imagined that I had spent the following 18 months rebuilding the last day of Caleb's life through medical records, financial documents, witness statements, and one small spiral notebook. My father finally lifted his head. "What do you want?" Gerald asked. He still sounded like a businessman negotiating a price. "I will help Emily," I said, "but I will not protect any of you from what comes next." Relief flickered across Selena's face, but it vanished when I looked at my father. "You thought I came back for the money," I told him. "I came back because I know someone changed Caleb's medical file while I was unconscious." For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in Gerald Carter's eyes. And I knew the worst truth was still waiting for me. My name is Vivian Reed, and before my family taught me how dangerous trust could be, I worked as the head children's librarian in Maplewood, Iowa. Maplewood was a town of white church steeples, old brick storefronts, and fields that stretched so far beyond the county road that sunset seemed to settle directly on the earth. People there knew one another's grandparents, divorces, and medical histories. They remembered who had won the high school spelling competition 20 years earlier and which family had stopped speaking after an argument over inherited farmland. It was the sort of place where nobody remained a stranger for long. It was also the sort of place where a respected man could hide behind familiarity. My husband, David, had died 5 years before Caleb's death. A grain elevator malfunctioned during a routine inspection, and by the time emergency workers reached him, there was nothing anyone could do. Caleb had been 2 years old. For months after the funeral, I existed in pieces. I fed my son, went to work, and signed whatever documents were placed in front of me, but I remembered almost none of it later. That was when my father became indispensable. Gerald Carter owned an antique restoration business on the edge of Maplewood. He was known at church as a dependable donor, and in town as the man people called when estates needed to be valued or old furniture needed to be sold. After David's death, Gerald handled calls from insurance companies, lenders, and attorneys. "You take care of Caleb," he told me. "I'll protect you from the paperwork." I believed that was love. By the time Caleb turned 7, we had built a small life around the space David left behind. Caleb had sandy brown hair that never stayed flat and serious green eyes that made adults feel as though they were being studied. He noticed when an elderly library patron had forgotten her glasses. He remembered which children pretended not to like reading because they struggled with the words. He once spent half an hour sitting beneath a table with a frightened boy who refused to enter the story room without his mother. He wanted to become a doctor. A children's doctor, he always clarified. "Why children?" I asked once. "Because adults tell kids not to be scared instead of explaining why they're scared." That answer stayed with me. Every evening, Caleb and I read together on the porch swing. The Thursday before he died, the summer air smelled of cut grass and rain, waiting somewhere beyond the western fields. We were halfway through a chapter of Where the Red Fern Grows when Caleb closed the book. Mom? Yes? Do you still miss Dad when you're happy? The question startled me. I do. Does that ruin being happy? No. It changes it. He thought about that. When I become a doctor, I'm going to invent medicine for missing people. I smiled. What would it do? It would make the missing part hurt less, without making you forget. That sounds like very difficult medicine. I'm good at science. He disappeared into his bedroom before I could answer. Several minutes later, he returned with both hands behind his back. I made something. The necklace was made from braided red, blue, and yellow cord. Uneven wooden beads were threaded along it, and one bead carried a crooked black V drawn in marker. It's a protection charm, Caleb said. For me? He nodded. So bad things can't happen to you. He stood on his toes to fasten it around my neck. What protects you? I asked. He looked surprised by the question. You do. He said it with such complete faith that I felt something tighten inside my chest. I pulled him close. Forever and always. That evening, we went to my parents' house for Thursday dinner. My mother treated family meals as performances of stability. Margaret Carter used polished silverware, linen napkins, and the china she normally reserved for holidays, even though only 6 people sat at the table. Selena arrived 20 minutes late with her fiancé, Marcus Bennett, and her 5-year-old daughter, Emily. Emily ran directly to Caleb. I made us, she announced, unfolding a picture. 2 stick figures stood beneath a giant yellow sun. One had sandy hair, the other wore a purple dress. Above them, Emily had written, Caleb and Emily best cousins in uneven letters. Caleb studied it seriously. You made me taller. You are taller. Not that much. You will be when you're a doctor. He smiled, and placed the drawing carefully beside his plate. Selena entered behind her carrying fabric samples. Emily, stop bothering him. She isn't bothering me, Caleb said. Selena looked at me, rather than him. Children need to learn when adults are talking. The adults were discussing her wedding. For the next hour, my father encouraged Selena to replace nearly every affordable plan she and Marcus had chosen. A larger ballroom, imported flowers, a string quartet, custom lighting, a second dress for the reception. Marcus finally placed his fork down. We already have a budget. Gerald poured himself more wine. A wedding represents the family. It represents the marriage, Marcus replied. Selena sighed. Marcus, Dad is trying to help. With what money? My father did not hesitate. I'll arrange it. Selena smiled. Dad always finds money. At the other end of the table, Caleb stopped eating. Grandpa, were those men at your warehouse bringing wedding things? Gerald's expression changed so slightly that I almost missed it. What men? The ones with the black van. My father continued cutting his steak. You shouldn't wander around the loading area. I wasn't wandering. You brought me when Mom worked late. That does not mean you should pay attention to adult business. Caleb looked confused. One man dropped a box, and it didn't sound like furniture. Marcus glanced toward Gerald. What was in it? Nothing that concerns this family. His answer ended the discussion. Emily reached beneath the table and took Caleb's hand. Later, while everyone was preparing to leave, Gerald stood beside me in the entrance hall. Is Caleb still walking to school? Most mornings. You should consider driving him. Why? Children get distracted. He knows the route. My father looked toward Caleb, who was helping Emily fasten her coat. Some routes are safer than others. The comment seemed ordinary at the time. On the drive home, Caleb stared out the window. Mom? Yes? Grandpa said I should stop writing things down. What things? Cars, boxes, people. Why are you writing them? So I don't forget. Did he threaten you? No. Caleb hesitated. He asked which way I walked to school. A small uneasiness moved through me, but I pushed it aside. My father could be controlling and impatient, but I had never imagined him capable of frightening a child. Adults sometimes worry when children repeat things they don't understand, I said. But you can always tell me anything. I know. That night, I tucked him into bed and kissed his forehead. He waited until I reached the doorway before opening the small spiral notebook he kept in his desk. "What are you writing?" "Something from dinner." "Can I read it?" "Tomorrow." I switched off the light. Tomorrow never came for us. The hospital called at 8:17 the next morning. I was standing in the kitchen, turning a pancake, when my phone rang. "Mrs. Reed?" "Yes?" "Your son has been struck by a delivery vehicle. He is being transported to St. Mary's Hospital." The spatula slipped from my hand. "Is he alive?" "Yes, but you need to come immediately." I left the stove burning. I do not remember most of the drive. I remember a red traffic light that refused to change. I remember striking the steering wheel with both hands. I remember arriving at the hospital wearing one shoe because the other had come off near the front door. A nurse met me at the emergency entrance. "Caleb is in surgery. Is he alive?" "Yes." That word became the only thing holding me upright. Dr. Elizabeth Santos met me in a consultation room less than half an hour later. She was small, direct, and still wearing a surgical cap. "Caleb has serious internal injuries and a head injury," she explained. "He was conscious when the paramedics reached him. He responded to questions and asked whether his mother was coming." "He asked for me?" "He did." I covered my mouth. "We are controlling internal bleeding. His condition is critical, but he has a meaningful chance if we can stabilize him." A meaningful chance. I repeated those words until they became a prayer. My parents arrived after noon. Margaret entered carrying a food container. Gerald wore a dark suit and carried a leather document case. Neither of them asked to see Caleb first. My father wanted to know who was handling the administrative records. "I don't know," I said. "I'll take care of it." He walked toward the patient services corridor. Several minutes later, a hospital administrator approached me. "Mrs. Reed, your father says he has temporary authority to assist with Caleb's medical decisions." "What?" "He provided documentation connected to arrangements made after your husband's death." "I never gave him authority over Caleb." The administrator looked uncertain. Margaret appeared beside me. "You signed many papers after David died." "I would remember giving Dad control over my son." "You were barely sleeping then." "That does not mean I surrendered my rights." My mother lowered her voice. "Vivian, let Gerald handle the technical matters. You need to focus on Caleb." "I am focusing on Caleb." Before the administrator could continue, a nurse called me back to the surgical waiting area. Dr. Santos returned shortly after 1 in the afternoon. "The first operation controlled the most dangerous abdominal bleeding," she said. "Caleb remains in critical condition. We are monitoring the swelling around his brain and watching his heart closely." "Can I see him?" "For a few minutes." Caleb looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Machines surrounded the bed. A breathing tube covered his mouth. His hair had been shaved near one temple. I took his hand. "Mommy's here." His fingers did not move. I told him about the pancakes burning on the stove. I promised him a new backpack. I said we would finish our book together on the porch swing. For the rest of the afternoon, I moved between the waiting room and his bedside. Selena arrived near sunset with Marcus. She stood outside the intensive care room and looked through the glass for less than a minute. Then she asked Margaret whether the wedding coordinator still expected the final ballroom payment. Marcus stared at her. "Not now. We may have to postpone. Your nephew is in intensive care." "I know that." "Then stop discussing the venue." Selena crossed her arms. "I am trying to prevent another crisis." I turned away before I said something I could never take back. By evening, I had not eaten or slept. My hands trembled. Every alarm from the intensive care unit sent panic through my body. A physician from the overnight team found me struggling to breathe in the hallway. "You are having a severe panic response," he said. "We need you rested enough to understand any decisions the team may need to discuss." "I don't want medication. It will be a small dose." I resisted until my mother promised she would wake me if Caleb's condition changed. The medicine took effect quickly. Margaret guided me toward the family restroom. "The necklace might catch on the blanket," she said. Before I understood what she was doing, she unfastened Caleb's protection charm. "Give it back. I'll keep it safe." "Promise?" "Yes." It was the last promise I ever accepted from my mother. When I woke, the room was dark. My mouth felt dry, and my head seemed filled with fog. Voices carried from the corridor. That change should not have been approved without the mother, a nurse said. The administrator verified the representative. The paperwork looks wrong. Then contact risk management. The directive is already active. I pushed myself upright. What directive? Both nurses turned. One moved toward me. Mrs. Reed, you should lie down. What changed? Before she could answer, an alarm sounded from the intensive care unit. The nurses ran. I followed them. A staff member tried to block the entrance, but I pushed past him. Through the glass wall, I saw people surrounding Caleb's bed. The heart monitor produced one long, terrible sound. A doctor looked at the computer screen. A nurse shook her head. There was a brief exchange I could not hear. Then the room became strangely still. I struck the glass. That's my son. Margaret grabbed my arms from behind. Let them work. They aren't doing anything. Gerald stood several feet away. He was not crying. He watched the room with the same controlled expression he wore during business negotiations. At 3:47 in the morning, Dr. Harrison came into the consultation room. I am very sorry. I screamed before he finished speaking. He explained that Caleb's heart had stopped after complications from his injuries. He said the medical team had followed the active directives in the file. I did not understand what that meant. I only understood that my son was dead. Gerald placed one hand on my shoulder. There was nothing anyone could do. I pulled away. Dr. Santos said he had a chance. Doctors offer hope because it comforts families. Were you speaking to the doctors without me? I handled the paperwork you were incapable of handling. I was his mother. You were unconscious. The answer came too quickly. Margaret began crying. Vivian, please. This is not the time. Selena stood near the doorway, looking at her phone. The venue needs an answer before noon, she whispered to Marcus. He looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Your nephew just died. I know. Then put the phone away. She did, but her expression showed resentment rather than shame. After the machines were disconnected, I returned to Caleb's room. His hand was cold. I reached for the necklace and remembered my mother had removed it. Where is Caleb's charm? Margaret searched her purse briefly. I must have placed it somewhere else. You promised to keep it safe. This is not the moment to accuse me of losing jewelry. Jewelry. That was what she called the final thing my son made for me. While the nurses gathered Caleb's belongings, I opened his backpack. Beneath a spelling folder and a crushed sandwich, I found his spiral notebook. Most of the entries were harmless observations. A bird's nest outside the library. Emily crying, because Selena threw away one of her pictures. Several license plates Caleb liked because the numbers repeated. The final entry was shorter than I expected. Grandpa said stop writing about the warehouse. He asked which way I walked to school. I saw him near the corner this morning. I read it twice. At the time, I thought it meant my father had seen Caleb walking and failed to stop the accident. I did not yet understand that almost every person in that hospital had been told a different version of the truth. My father arranged Caleb's funeral as though he were disposing of a failed investment. He chose the least expensive coffin, rejected additional flowers, and scheduled the service for the earliest available date. The wedding is in 3 weeks, he explained. Extending this will not help anyone heal. Extending this. That was how he described burying my 7-year-old son. More than half the town attended the funeral. Teachers spoke about Caleb's kindness. Children from the library left drawings and handwritten notes beside his coffin. Dr. Santos stood alone in the back row, her expression strained. Selena arrived late. She spent the reception checking messages from wedding vendors. 9 days after the funeral, an email arrived from Midwest Family Assurance informing me that a death benefit claim had been approved for payment. The amount was $800,000. David and I had purchased a family protection package shortly after Caleb was born. The largest part of the policy was intended to support Caleb if one of us died, but the package also contained an accidental death provision covering him. I had almost forgotten it existed. The email said the funds would be released within several business days to the policy owner and listed beneficiary. I called the company immediately. A claims manager named Jennifer Morrison invited me to their office. She read the account information, then looked at me with visible discomfort. The policy owner is listed as Gerald Carter. That's my father. Yes. He did not purchase the policy. Our records show ownership was transferred 5 years ago. She turned the monitor toward me. A transfer form carried what appeared to be my signature. The date was 2 months after David's death. I never signed that. The form was notarized. I don't care. I never signed it. A second document changed the beneficiary from the family trust to Gerald. Jennifer printed copies. Has the money already been transferred? I asked. Not yet. The final release is scheduled for early next week. Stop it. I do not personally have the authority. You need to file a formal dispute immediately. I called my father from the parking lot. He answered on the 4th attempt. What have you done? You need to be more specific. You forged my signature and took ownership of Caleb's policy. Insurance structures were reorganized after David died. I never authorized that. You were in no condition to make financial decisions, so you made yourself the beneficiary? I protected the asset. From whom? From you. The answer left me momentarily speechless. You used my grief to steal my son's insurance. Do not use the word steal. What word would you prefer? Family management. Selena's voice came through the background. Is that Vivian? They were together. I opened the family group chat. A message from Selena appeared. Dad used a company credit line to secure the ballroom and vendors. The insurance payout will repay it when it clears. The contracts are non-refundable, so please do not create unnecessary drama. The wedding expenses had been paid before the insurance company released the money. Gerald had borrowed against the expected payout, confident that the forged documents would survive long enough for him to collect. I typed, "That money came from Caleb's death." Selena replied, "The money can still help people who are alive." Then Margaret added, "Your sister should not lose her wedding because of a tragedy no one could prevent." I called Marcus. When he answered, music and voices echoed behind him. "Do you know where the wedding money came from?" There was a pause. Gerald sold part of an investment property. No, he used a credit line against Caleb's insurance. That isn't what I was shown. What were you shown? A purchase agreement, a transfer record. Those documents are false. In the background, Selena called his name. Marcus lowered his voice. "Vivian, I am sorry about Caleb, but your father gave me documents from his accountant. He gave the insurance company documents too." Selena took the phone. "You are grieving and confused. I have the transfer forms. Then challenge them after the wedding. Cancel the contracts." "We cannot." "You will not." "No," she said. "I will not allow your tragedy to become the only thing this family is permitted to feel." 3 weeks after Caleb died, Selena married Marcus at Riverside Manor. I did not attend. On the afternoon of the ceremony, Martha came to my house and sat with me while I sorted Caleb's school papers. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and immediately turned it face down. "What is it?" "Nothing you need to see, Martha." She hesitated, then handed me the phone. My mother had posted a photograph. Selena stood beneath an arch of imported flowers, wearing a satin gown and Caleb's protection necklace. The red, blue, and yellow cord rested against the white fabric. The crooked V faced the camera. Beneath the photograph, Margaret had written, "A family blessing for our beautiful bride." I called her. "You took the necklace." "Vivian, today is not about you. Caleb made that for me. It was in my purse, and Selena needed something colorful. You removed it while I was sedated. You were in no condition to care for valuables. Give it back. The ceremony has already begun. Tell her to take it off." Selena's voice came through the phone. "It matches the flowers. It was the last gift my son gave me. He would want the family to use it. Do not speak for him. You always make everything sacred because it belongs to you. He was 7. And he is gone." The words were followed by silence. I had spent years excusing Selena's cruelty as insecurity. I had explained my father's control as practicality and my mother's emotional coldness as discipline. That afternoon, the excuses ended. I drove to my parents' empty house while the reception continued across town. A message blinked on the answering machine. Gerald's voice filled the room. "Vivian, stop contacting the insurance company. Stop asking questions about my business. You are interfering with matters you do not understand, and you have already lost enough. I replayed the message 3 times. Then I packed. I resigned from the library. I closed my bank account and withdrew what little remained. I asked Martha to tell no one where I was going. I took Caleb's photograph, his notebook, and the copies Jennifer had printed. Everything else stayed behind. Before sunrise, I drove out of Maplewood. At the county line, I pulled over and opened Caleb's notebook. Grandpa said stop writing about the warehouse. He asked which way I walked to school. I saw him near the corner this morning. Until then, I believed my father had stolen from Caleb after his death. I had no idea he had arrived at the hospital carrying documents prepared before anyone knew whether my son would survive. My new life in Cedar Rapids began above a laundromat. The apartment was small enough that I could reach the kitchen sink from the edge of my bed. Commercial dryers vibrated beneath the floor late into the night, and the smell of detergent settled into my clothes. During the day, I washed dishes at a restaurant. At night, I cleaned office buildings. Exhaustion kept me functional. When I stopped moving, I remembered Caleb asking whether I would always protect him. For 6 months, I did little except work, sleep, and reread his notebook. Then Martha found me. She had honored my request not to reveal my location, but she refused to let me disappear completely. We met at a diner outside Cedar Rapids. "You look like you're trying to punish yourself," she said. "I'm trying to survive." She placed a business card on the table. Jake Morrison, private investigator. He used to investigate insurance fraud. I helped him with a records search years ago. I can't afford a private investigator. Let him decide that. Jake was in his late 50s, with silver hair and the patient expression of someone accustomed to hearing stories people struggled to tell. He read Caleb's notebook carefully. "This is not proof," he said when he finished. "I know, but it may identify where proof exists." Jake introduced me to Naomi Brooks, an attorney who specialized in financial crimes and victims' rights. Naomi did not tell me everything would be all right. That was one reason I trusted her. She reviewed the policy documents first. "We need the original forms and the notary record," she said. "But the hospital file may be more urgent. The hospital told me Caleb died from his injuries. The medical record will tell us exactly what occurred." As Caleb's mother and the representative of his estate, I had the right to request his complete records. St. Mary's sent hundreds of pages. Dr. Santos's initial notes appeared near the beginning. Caleb had been conscious upon arrival. He had answered questions. The first surgery had controlled the most dangerous internal bleeding. His condition remained critical, but the notes repeatedly described continued treatment and close monitoring. I read every page twice. Nothing explained the strange stillness after his heart stopped. Naomi noticed a reference in the nursing record. "What is it?" I asked. There was a change in his code status. "What does that mean?" "It means the instructions governing what the medical team should do if his heart or breathing stopped were changed." "By whom?" "The underlying form is missing." Naomi sent un secondement. St. Mary's legal department resisted for more than a week before releasing an additional group of documents. The directive was on the 4th page. "Do not resuscitate." Gerald's signature appeared at the bottom. He had identified himself as Caleb's temporary court-appointed medical guardian. Attached to the directive was an emergency guardianship order. Naomi studied the document. "This is false." "How can you know?" "The case number is not in the county court's format. The judge's signature block is wrong." She called the court clerk while I sat across from her. No guardianship petition had ever been filed. No judge had granted Gerald authority over Caleb. The order was forged. Further examination showed that the main document had been created before the accident. Blank spaces had been left for the hospital name, admission date, and attending physician. Gerald knew St. Mary's was the only regional pediatric trauma center equipped to handle injuries as severe as Caleb's. After the ambulance took my son there, he completed the remaining fields. My father had prepared for the hospital before the truck ever struck Caleb. "What did this directive do?" I asked. Naomi answered carefully. "It did not prevent the first surgery. A do not resuscitate directive generally applies when the heart or breathing stops. When Caleb's heart stopped, they didn't try to restart it. The record shows that the team followed the directive. Would he have lived? No responsible doctor can promise that. His injuries were severe. That is not what I asked. She looked directly at me. Without the directive, the medical team would have attempted full resuscitation. I remembered striking the glass. I remembered the doctor looking at the computer. I remembered my father standing in the hallway, calm and silent. The hospital opened an internal review. A nurse named Hannah Pierce agreed to speak to us through her attorney. I questioned the order, Hannah said. The grandfather brought the paperwork early in the day. He said the mother had transferred authority after her husband died. Did anyone verify the court order? Naomi asked. The administrator called the grandmother. Margaret. What did she say? I asked. That Gerald had full authority, and that you wanted him to make decisions because you were emotionally unstable. I felt physically ill. Dr. Santos objected, Hannah continued. She wanted an ethics consultation, but Caleb went into cardiac arrest before the review occurred. Why didn't anyone wake me? We were told you were sedated, and your representative had already made the decision. My representative. My father had transformed my temporary unconsciousness into permission to decide whether my son should be revived. Naomi warned me that the documents proved forgery, fraud, and potentially criminal responsibility for Caleb's death, but they did not prove Gerald caused the collision. Do not confront him, she said. If his warehouse records connect to this, an early confrontation will give him time to destroy evidence. Jake reopened Caleb's notebook. We begin with the vehicles and the warehouse. I looked at my son's handwriting. My father had not improvised at the hospital. He had arrived with a plan. Jake turned Caleb's notebook into a timeline. Most entries were ordinary. A blue jay outside the library. A cracked paving stone near school. Emily crying because Selena threw away one of her drawings. Then patterns emerged. Caleb had copied several license plates because he liked repeated numbers. Jake found that 3 plates belonged to companies sharing the same postal address. The companies supposedly purchased restored antiques from Gerald's warehouse. None had employees. 2 had never filed local tax records. 1 listed an abandoned building as its headquarters. Caleb had drawn boxes in the warehouse. Some were labeled chairs, others were labeled soft boxes. Jake asked whether Caleb knew what large amounts of cash looked like. I don't know. A former warehouse employee provided the answer. Raymond Ellis had quit shortly after Caleb's death. He agreed to meet only after Naomi explained that federal investigators could protect cooperating witnesses. I saw the boy in the loading area, Raymond said. 1 crate had been left open. It was filled with bundled cash. Did Caleb understand what he saw? Jake asked. He asked whether it was money for the wedding. What did Gerald do? He took the notebook from Caleb's hand and read several pages. My stomach tightened. What did he say? He told me children who repeat adult business create dangerous problems. Raymond described Gerald's operation. The antique business purchased genuine furniture at estate sales. Items were then assigned fictional restoration costs and sold to shell companies at grossly inflated prices. The money transferred through those sales appeared legitimate. Lisa Wong, the forensic accountant Naomi hired, compared the available records. An armoire purchased for several $100s was supposedly sold for nearly $20,000, yet photographs showed it still standing in Gerald's warehouse months later. A set of dining chairs was sold 3 times to companies controlled by the same hidden owner. The pattern suggested money laundering on a scale far greater than the insurance fraud. Martha supplied another critical detail. A month before Caleb died, Gerald came to the library, she told Naomi. He wanted information about transferring ownership of life insurance policies. What else did he research? Emergency guardianship and medical decision-making. Before the accident? Yes. Martha signed a formal witness statement. Naomi assembled the evidence into 2 separate packages. The financial records went to federal prosecutors. The forged court order and hospital directive went to the county attorney. She clearly separated facts from theories. Gerald had forged my signature. He had prepared a false guardianship order. He knew Caleb had seen cash at the warehouse. He had lied about his authority at the hospital. What we still could not prove was whether he had arranged the collision. The insurance company froze the death benefit before Gerald could receive the full payment, but his company had already borrowed heavily against it. Without the payout, the bridge loan became immediately due. The wedding vendors had been paid, but Gerald's businesses began collapsing under the debt. That was when he called me. The number was unfamiliar. Vivian. Naomi had explained that I could legally record conversations in which I participated, so I activated the recorder. What do you want? You filed a fraudulent dispute against the insurance policy. I challenged forged documents. You are attracting attention you cannot control. Good. You think strangers in government care about your son? They care about financial records. You have no idea what you are interfering with. I know you prepared a false court order before Caleb reached the hospital. Silence. Then his voice became quieter. Who gave you that file? It belongs to me. You should stop. Why? Because you have already lost enough. The threat settled between us. You asked Caleb which way he walked to school, I said. He was a child. He misunderstood conversations. He wrote that he saw you near the corner. Gerald laughed. The sound was too quick and too controlled. That boy was not supposed to be there that morning. My heart began beating so hard that I struggled to breathe. What does that mean? He disconnected. Investigators reviewed the recording. It shows knowledge, Naomi said, but he can claim he meant Caleb normally used another route. Did he? No. Then why isn't this enough? Because suspicion is not proof of murder. The federal investigation continued for months. During that time, I saw photographs of Emily through Selena's public social media posts. At first, I looked because she reminded me of Caleb. Then I noticed the bruises. A dark mark near her elbow. Another on her shin. Her face appeared pale in photographs from a dance recital. Selena wrote that Emily had a stubborn virus. Several weeks later, the child wore a hospital bracelet. Then came a photograph taken outside pediatric hematology. I hated Selena. I feared Gerald. I no longer knew what I felt toward my mother. But when I looked at Emily, I saw only the little girl who had held Caleb's hand beneath the dinner table. She had done nothing wrong. Federal agents entered Gerald's warehouse, 18 months after Caleb died. The search began before sunrise. They seized computers, storage devices, account ledgers, shipment records, and boxes of financial documents. By midday, television crews stood outside the locked gates. Maplewood watched Gerald Carter's reputation collapse in real time. The government froze several business accounts. Gerald's company could no longer service the bridge loan used for Selena's wedding, and creditors began pursuing assets tied to the transaction. Marcus contacted Naomi. He arrived at her office carrying a folder of documents Gerald and Selena had shown him before the wedding. A land purchase agreement. A statement from a supposed accountant. A transfer schedule showing the wedding money coming from the sale of investment property. Lisa reviewed them. The purchase agreement is fabricated, she said. The buyer company did not exist on the date of the supposed sale. Marcus looked sick. Vivian warned me. Yes, I said. Selena told me your grief had made you paranoid. Gerald showed me these documents. I wanted to believe them. You still married her. I did. He did not attempt to excuse himself. That is something I will have to live with. Marcus provided emails and wedding invoices to federal investigators. In one message, Selena had asked Gerald whether the insurance dispute could expose the source of the ballroom payment. 2 days after the interview, Marcus left the marital home. The warehouse evidence allowed investigators to obtain additional warrants. A municipal license plate camera had captured Gerald's vehicle entering a service alley near Maple Street shortly before Caleb was struck. A second camera recorded the same vehicle, leaving minutes after the collision. Gerald had told police he was at home. His alibi was false. The evidence placed him near Caleb. It did not yet show what he had done there. Then Selena called me. I had not heard her voice since the wedding. Vivian. She sounded as though she had been crying for days. What happened? It's Emily. The bruises had not been caused by a virus or vitamin deficiency. Emily had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Initial treatment had reduced some of the cancer, but not enough. Her doctors recommended a stem cell transplant if a suitable donor could be found. Selena was not a match. Neither of our parents could donate. The registry had not produced a sufficiently compatible donor who could complete the process within the medical window. What about Daniel's family? I asked. Emily's biological father, Daniel Price, had died before she turned 2. There's no one available, Selena said. Marcus was never her legal father. The doctors want every blood relative tested. I closed my eyes. For one terrible moment, I remembered Selena's message after Caleb died. The money can still help people who are alive. I could have repeated those words. I could have allowed her to hear how cruelty sounded when it returned. Instead, I asked, "Where do I go for testing?" She began sobbing. I contacted Emily's medical team directly. The evaluation took several appointments. Blood tests, tissue typing, a physical examination, a psychological consultation to ensure I understood the risks and was not being forced. Naomi accompanied me to the final meeting. "You do not owe Selena this," she said. "No. You do not owe Margaret or Gerald." "No. Then be certain you know why you are doing it. Because Emily is not them." The early tests showed that I was the strongest available family candidate. Confirmatory testing supported the match. I signed the donor consent forms. I did not tell my family. They found me before the transplant team officially contacted Selena. I walked out of the hospital after my final evaluation and saw Gerald, Margaret, and Selena waiting near the parking structure. The scene I would remember for the rest of my life began with my father lowering himself to his knees. Selena followed. Margaret stood for several seconds before joining them. "Please," Selena said. "Emily is dying." I looked at my mother. "She is innocent," Margaret whispered. So was Caleb. My father lifted his head. "What do you want?" "I do not want your money." "The house?" "No." "Then name your price." "The truth." Selena looked from me to Gerald. "What truth?" "The truth about Caleb's policy, the hospital, the warehouse, everything you destroyed or concealed." Gerald stood. "You are using Emily's life to force a confession." "No. I will help Emily, because she is innocent. But I will not lie for any of you, and I will not ask investigators to stop. You expect us to trust you? I no longer care whether you trust me." I turned to Selena. "If you want me beside Emily during treatment, you will give Naomi every document and every message you kept. You will stop protecting the man who protected none of our children." My father's face hardened. "You do not know what happened." "Then tell me." He said nothing. They believed Emily's survival depended on satisfying my conditions. They did not know I had already agreed to donate. I was not holding a child's life hostage. I was waiting to see whether fear would finally force my family to tell the truth. Naomi arranged separate interviews. Margaret came first. Without Gerald beside her, my mother appeared smaller than I remembered. Not gentler, not remorseful, simply diminished. Naomi placed the forged guardianship order on the table. "Did you tell hospital staff that Gerald had legal authority to make medical decisions for Caleb?" Margaret stared at the page. "Yes." "Did you believe that statement was true?" She did not answer. "Mrs. Carter?" "No." The word entered the room quietly. I felt my nails press into my palms. "Why did you lie?" Naomi asked. "Gerald said the doctors were prolonging suffering." "Caleb had survived surgery," I said. "He said Caleb would never be normal. He had a name." My mother looked at me. "I was afraid of your father." "You were more afraid of Gerald than of helping him take away Caleb's last chance?" She began to cry. For most of her life, Margaret had treated morality as reputation. She did not ask whether an action was wrong. She asked whether respectable people would find out. Naomi asked about the necklace. Margaret admitted removing it while I was sedated. "Where did it go?" "Selena saw it in my purse on the wedding morning." "And you gave it to her?" "Yes." "Why?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Selena said wearing it would prove Vivian could not ruin her day." The answer cut deeper than the excuses ever had. Selena had not worn Caleb's gift because it matched her flowers. She had worn it as proof that my family would choose her even over my dead child. Margaret agreed to cooperate with investigators. At Naomi's insistence, she also issued a public statement to her church. She admitted that she had lied to hospital staff, concealed the source of the wedding money, and allowed her grandson's final gift to be used as an act of cruelty. The church removed her from every committee. Friends she had known for decades stopped inviting her into their homes. Margaret lost the social position she had protected at the expense of her daughter and grandson. Selena's interview lasted nearly 4 hours. At first, she insisted she had not understood the policy. Naomi placed printed emails on the table. In one, Selena had written, "Dad says the ownership transfer is too old for Vivian to challenge." In another, "Once the wedding vendors are paid, there will be nothing she can do." Selena stopped denying it. "I knew the money came from the policy." "You knew it was paid because Caleb died," I said. "Yes. And you spent it. Dad said it belonged to the family. You called my son expensive." I was angry. "You wore his necklace." Her face twisted. "I wanted you to see that they still chose me." There it was. The truth beneath years of cruelty. Selena had spent her life measuring love through competition. When I married David, she rushed into a serious relationship. When Caleb was born, she became obsessed with having a child. When David died and people offered me sympathy, she complained that the family discussed my grief too often. She did not only want happiness, she wanted evidence that I possessed less. "What did Gerald ask you to destroy?" Naomi asked. Selena removed a small storage drive from her purse. Emails, company records, messages about the insurance loan. "Why did you keep copies?" "Because I knew he would blame me if everything collapsed." Self-preservation had accomplished what conscience had not. The files strengthened the federal case. Marcus filed for divorce. He continued visiting Emily, but because he had never adopted her, he had no automatic custody rights. "I loved your daughter," he told Selena during a supervised meeting. "But you built our wedding with money taken from a dead child and lied to me with forged documents." Gerald refused to cooperate. Through his attorney, he offered to plead guilty to limited financial charges if prosecutors ended the investigation into Caleb's death. They refused. His defense remained simple. He had been near Maple Street on business. He had seen the aftermath of the collision. He had believed Caleb would never recover. The hospital directive, he claimed, had been mercy. "You will never prove I touched him," he told me during a monitored meeting. He wore a jail-issued uniform while waiting for the federal financial case, but his voice still carried the old confidence. "That is what you're counting on," I said. "I am counting on facts." "So am I." Investigators had already located a missing source of evidence. Immediately after the collision, the delivery company's insurer had collected surveillance recordings from nearby businesses. The police report relied on a front-facing camera that showed the truck driver could not stop in time. The insurer had preserved the full raw video in its claim archive. When prosecutors reopened the case, they obtained every camera angle. One recording came from a pharmacy near the service alley. The image was dark and partly blocked by a parked vehicle. Technicians enhanced the original file rather than a copied version. The footage showed Caleb waiting near the corner. A man emerged from the alley behind him. The man's face was not visible, but the coat matched one seized from Gerald's home. A heavy ring flashed on his right hand. The municipal camera had already placed his vehicle nearby. The final recovered frames were still processing when Raymond Ellis contacted prosecutors again. The former warehouse employee had decided to cooperate fully. He admitted Gerald had asked him to obtain the truck's regular delivery schedule several weeks before Caleb died. "Why?" the prosecutor asked. Gerald said he needed to know when Maple Street would be busy. "Did he mention Caleb?" "Not at first." "And later?" Raymond looked toward me. "The night before the accident, he said the boy had seen too much, and that he had already prepared a solution if the impact failed." The room became completely silent. "What solution?" Naomi asked. "Hospital papers." The testimony connected the warehouse, the truck schedule, and the forged medical order. But Gerald's attorney could still attack Raymond as an accomplice seeking leniency. We needed the final frames. 2 days later, Naomi called me to her office. The enhanced footage was waiting on the screen. Caleb stood at the curb. The truck approached. Gerald moved behind him. Then my father raised both hands. The recovered video lasted less than half a minute. I watched it once. That was enough. Caleb stood near the curb with his backpack over both shoulders. The pedestrian signal had not changed. Gerald emerged from the service alley. He looked toward the approaching delivery truck. Then he placed both hands against my son's back and pushed. The driver struck the brakes immediately. There was no time. After the impact, Gerald stepped backward. He did not run to Caleb. He did not call for help. He disappeared into the alley and drove away before the police arrived. The image was not perfect, but it did not stand alone. The license plate cameras placed Gerald's vehicle at the scene. His phone records contradicted his claim that he was at home. Raymond testified that Gerald had obtained the truck schedule. Caleb's notebook showed Gerald had questioned his walking route. The false guardianship packet had been prepared in advance. The hospital directive completed the plan if Caleb survived the collision. Federal investigators also confirmed the motive. Caleb had seen cash and vehicle numbers at the warehouse. Gerald knew the notebook could lead me, or a teacher or police officer, to the shell companies. He did not kill Caleb primarily for the insurance benefit. He killed him because a 7-year-old child had become a witness. The insurance money was simply another asset Gerald intended to collect after silencing him. State investigators arrested my father for Caleb's death. The federal financial charges remained separate. Gerald's attorney attacked the video, Raymond's credibility, and the interpretation of the hospital records. But each explanation created another contradiction. If Gerald had been near Maple Street by chance, why had he lied about being home? If the collision was an accident, why had he researched the truck schedule? If the directive was mercy, why had he prepared a false guardianship order before the accident? If Caleb's notebook meant nothing, why had Gerald ordered warehouse records destroyed? The defense began collapsing. While prosecutors prepared the murder case, Emily entered the most dangerous stage of her treatment. I completed the donation procedure. Before the collection, Selena came to my hospital room carrying a small wooden box. Inside was Caleb's necklace. The red, blue, and yellow cord had faded. One bead was cracked. The crooked V was still visible. "I kept it after the wedding," she said. "Why?" "At first because I knew you wanted it." The honesty surprised me. "And later?" "Because every time I looked at it, I remembered what I had done." I lifted the necklace from the box. "Returning it does not earn forgiveness." "I know. It does not prove you changed." "I know that too." She sat beside the bed. "I wore it because I wanted you to suffer. I thought if Mom and Dad chose me, it meant I mattered more." "Caleb was a child." "I know. You helped erase him." Her face collapsed. "I know." There was nothing else to say. The transplant itself was not a single dramatic surgery. It was weeks of preparation, conditioning treatment, infection precautions, and waiting. Emily's donor cells were infused through a central line. I sat beside her wearing protective clothing. Her hair was gone. Her face was swollen from medication. "Did it hurt when you gave me your cells?" she asked. "A little." "Why did you do it?" "Because none of this was your fault." She looked down at her hands. "Mom says you hate our family." Adults sometimes confuse anger with hate. Would Caleb want me to live? Yes. I answered without hesitation. He wanted to become a doctor. He would want every child to have a chance. Selena's emotional condition deteriorated as the investigation, divorce, and Emily's illness closed around her. She missed medical meetings. She disappeared for several days and was found in a motel after mixing alcohol with prescription medication. The hospital requested an emergency review of Emily's care arrangements. Gerald was incarcerated. Margaret faced criminal charges and could not be appointed. Marcus was not Emily's legal father. With Selena's temporary consent and a court order, I received medical guardianship while Emily remained in treatment. It was not adoption. It did not erase Selena's rights. It allowed me to make decisions while my niece fought for her life. For weeks, every laboratory result seemed capable of destroying us. Emily developed a dangerous fever. Her blood counts remained low. An infection required immediate treatment. Then the donor cells began to work. The physician showed me the result. Engraftment has started. I sat beside Emily's bed and wept. Not because everything was over. It was not. Gerald had not yet been sentenced. Emily was not yet safe. My family had not become whole. But for the first time since Caleb died, something created from his memory had saved, rather than destroyed. Emily did not recover in a single miraculous morning. She remained in the hospital for weeks, and returned for regular treatment for months. Her immune system was fragile. Every fever frightened me. Every bruise made the adults around her stop breathing. But the cancer entered remission. The first day she returned to school, she wore a purple hat and carried the old drawing of herself and Caleb in her backpack. The legal cases continued. Gerald eventually accepted a plea agreement in the state case after prosecutors made clear that the video, location records, hospital documents, and Raymond's testimony would all be presented to a jury. He admitted that he pushed Caleb into the road and used the forged guardianship order to ensure that my son would not be revived if he survived the initial injuries. The federal court handled the financial crimes separately. Gerald pleaded guilty to money laundering, insurance fraud, document forgery, and obstruction. The combined sentences meant he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. At the state sentencing hearing, he tried to describe his actions as decisions made under pressure from dangerous associates. The prosecutor asked him a simple question. "You protected your family by murdering a 7-year-old member of it?" Gerald had no answer. When I addressed the court, I did not speak about revenge. I spoke about Caleb. I described the way he helped frightened children at the library. I described his dream of becoming a doctor. I told the judge about the protection necklace and the faith with which he believed his mother could keep him safe. "My father will spend years explaining that he was afraid," I said. Caleb was afraid too. He was 7. The difference is that Caleb never used fear as permission to destroy another person. Gerald did not look at me. Margaret pleaded guilty to offenses related to the false medical authority, false statements, and obstruction. Her cooperation reduced her punishment, but it did not preserve the life she valued. Her reputation in Maplewood vanished. The church community that once treated her as a moral authority now knew she had helped her husband take away her grandson's chance to live. Selena forfeited property linked to Gerald's crimes and entered a plea on financial charges. Her cooperation, the records she preserved, and the absence of evidence that she knew about the planned collision kept her from receiving a long prison sentence. She did not escape consequence. Her marriage ended. Her financial security disappeared. Her contact with Emily remained supervised while she underwent treatment and attempted to rebuild her life. My temporary guardianship was extended. For a time, Selena improved. She attended therapy, found work, and kept her scheduled visits. She never stopped being Emily's mother, but she slowly accepted that loving a child did not automatically make someone capable of providing safety. More than a year after the transplant, Selena supported my petition for permanent guardianship. The adoption came later. There were home studies, court hearings, psychological evaluations, and difficult conversations about loyalty, grief, and identity. No one treated adoption as a prize I had won by exposing my family. Emily was old enough to understand that becoming my daughter did not require her to erase Selena. At the final hearing, the judge asked whether she wanted me to become her legal mother. Emily looked at me. "I already call her Mama Vivian when I'm scared," she said. "I want to call her that when I'm happy too." The judge approved the adoption. The insurance company eventually acknowledged that Gerald's transfer documents should not have been processed without direct confirmation from me. Because the death benefit had been frozen before final release, most of the money was preserved. St. Mary's Hospital also accepted responsibility for failing to verify the guardianship order and for allowing a disputed directive to remain active without contacting me. The settlements, recovered criminal assets, and insurance funds gave me more money than I wanted to keep. So I created Caleb's Shield. The foundation provided legal assistance to children whose trusts, insurance benefits, or inherited property were being exploited by relatives. We also funded independent patient advocates for families involved in disputed medical authority cases. The first child we helped was a boy whose uncle had been draining his disability trust. The second was a girl whose guardian attempted to sell a house left to her by her mother. Every case reminded me of Caleb recording license plates, because he believed that if adults received the correct information, they would do the right thing. 3 years after Emily's transplant, we returned to Maplewood Cemetery. She carried the picture she had drawn of herself and Caleb beneath the giant yellow sun. I carried the protection necklace. Caleb's original headstone had been replaced. The new stone read, Caleb David Reed, beloved son, protector of children. Emily placed her drawing beneath his name. Do you think he knows what we did? She asked. I hope so. She looked at the necklace wrapped around my fingers. Did it protect you? I thought about the promise Caleb had made on our porch swing. The necklace had not stopped the truck. It had not stopped Gerald. It had not prevented betrayal, grief, or the discovery that my own parents had chosen themselves over my son. But it had survived. So had I. I knelt and rested my hand against Caleb's name. You tried to protect me, I whispered. Now we're protecting them. Emily slipped her hand into mine. The afternoon sun warmed the stone beneath my palm. Caleb once promised that his little necklace would protect me from bad things. It never stopped the bad things from coming, but it gave me the strength to make sure they did not win.